A fortress on the Great Plains where savagery ripped a town apart.
There was a time when the poor residents of this town must have felt like they were living in a war zone.
An Alaskan venture where nature won over greed.
A huge geyser of water shot up into the air, and then the tunnels flooded.
And a forgotten street in the Big Easy where a national icon learned his trade.
This ground is a sacred place in American cultural history.
Scattered across the United States are abandoned structures and those who know their stories. These forgotten ruins reveal the past of this land and its people. These are the secrets of hidden America. In western Montana lies a small town that's past has been dominated by one violent institution.
The building looms large and ominous at the end of the town's one street.
From some angles, it looks like a castle or fort, but from other angles, it looks like a train depot or station. It's not immediately obvious, that's for sure.
One of the buildings feels almost like a theater with this beautiful facade and these impressive columns.
News coming from the facility was of great interest to the local community.
If you lived in Deer Lodge, Montana, chances are you know someone who worked here. That wasn't necessarily a good thing.
Control of the complex was once completely lost.
Someone took over this facility, and you couldn't imagine a worse person for it to fall into the hands of.
All we knew was that there was one dead.
A violent battle for supremacy erupted, sending shockwaves around the country and beyond.
For 36 hours, it was utter madness.
They were going to set the staff on fire.
He had a bazooka, and he shot a bazooka at one of the towers.
Built close to the center of a small town, a priority for this complex has always been to contain the chaos. For 130 years, the perimeter wall has been an effective last line of defense.
It's 24 feet high and extends underground approximately 4 feet.
Ray Worthy has spent decades working in facilities like this and knows the value of secure defenses.
There had been a lot of attempts to tunnel under it, but none of them were ever successful in getting under it.
The man responsible for constructing this incredibly impressive wall is a local legend.
Frank Conley first arrived in Deer Lodge in 1886 as a 22-year-old deputy sheriff from eastern Montana. Within 4 years, he had risen to the top of this facility's hierarchy.
Frank Conley was now in charge of 198 men who called this place home. But it wasn't a home any of them dreamed of inhabiting.
This is the Old Montana State Prison. Opened in 1871, it was an attempt to tame the Wild West and rid Montana of the bandits and vigilantes who were leaving a path of death and destruction. Under Warden Conley's rule, it was no ordinary penitentiary.
Connolly routinely held meetings with his prisoners to hear grievances.
For years, this policy worked in Conley's favor. But one day, his openness backfired.
4 men burst into Conley's office, the leader wielding a knife.
He had the forethought to have a Colt revolver in his drawer, and it probably saved his life.
Conley fired twice, wounding the assailants, but not enough to prevent them launching an attack.
They savagely slit the throat of his deputy, John Robinson, before turning their eyes on Conley himself.
Conley was lucky to be alive. One of the slashes came within 1/8 of an inch of his jugular vein, and he required 103 stitches.
The inmates survived. Connolly waited for them to heal, and then they were sentenced to death. Connolly personally oversaw the hangings.
Undeterred by this ordeal, Warden Conley instigated a massive prison expansion and modernization project.
Conley was a firm believer that idleness bred insurrection. So most of the prison was built by the inmates themselves.
This large red brick building was known as Cell Block 1, or the 1912 cell block. It was built entirely by prisoners, and just in 11 months, this is an impressive feat.
But Conley's strategy of using a prison workforce would ultimately become his downfall.
He was very innovative. By 1917, he had 60% of the inmates working outside the prison walls.
Connolly loaned his prisoners out to building sites across the state. The unions were furious because Connolly was taking jobs away from not incarcerated men, from union members.
Eager to please the unions, the governor promptly removed Conley from his position as warden.
He served as warden for 30 years before one of the longest reigns in U.S. prison history came to an end. In the post-Conley era, standards nosedived, and the institution became dangerously overcrowded.
A state investigation in 1931 found one of the cell blocks to be, quote, a disgrace to civilization.
The atmosphere inside was understandably roiled. It must have felt like a tinderbox, just waiting for a spark to ignite it.
Poorly trained and under-equipped guards meant life inside was unofficially run by a select few inmates. For one power-hungry criminal who dreamed of controlling his own prison, Montana State was perfect.
Jerry Miles is what you would call a career prisoner. He spent most of his life bouncing between various institutions.
Miles had heard that the Montana State Prison had fairly relaxed rules, and he thought that it would be the perfect place to fulfill his dream of running a prison from the inside. The only problem was, Miles was living in Georgia as a free man at the time, so he hatched a plan.
He purchased a bus ticket to Butte, which is about 40 miles from here, was promptly arrested for burglary, and then sentenced for 5 years in Montana State Prison.
Miles, despite his history of violent and even psychotic behavior, was placed within the general population at the prison. Now, this was just trouble waiting to happen.
10 months later, his plan to take control of the prison was ready. The heavily outnumbered guards, meanwhile, were ill-prepared.
The 1959 riot, how they think it started was through inmate Miles. They took some flammable liquids and threw on a guard, and they threatened to burn the guard unless they give him the rifle. Rather than be burned up, they give him the rifle.
Miles and his 21-strong inmate mob then rounded up as many prison staff as they could and locked them in the cells.
They took the mattresses off, soaked them in flammable liquids, and left them in there, and they say, well, if you don't let us out, all we have to do is throw a match in there and they'll burn to death.
With control of the prison, an armed Miles headed to the deputy warden's office.
Miles burst into his office wielding a cleaver.
On the 16th of April, 1959, a deranged inmate at the Montana State Prison named Jerry Miles and his accomplice Lee Smart had taken 18 prison employees hostage and began a vicious attack on the deputy warden.
He managed to deflect the first few blows, but he couldn't do anything to stop Miles' right-hand man, Smart, from firing a rifle right into his chest.
The rioters allowed the deputy's body to be removed from the prison. For Marlene and her friend Phyllis, whose parents both worked inside, it's a moment neither of them will ever forget.
Cops came up And they said, girls, we need to take you over to the prison. There's been problems. We were right over across from Tower 7. Just as we were watching the door open, the inmates had brought the body out. Phyllis looked over and she said, oh my God, Marlene, I hope that's not anybody we know. And it was her dad. We didn't know that at the time, but it was her dad.
Wives and families of guards who were hostages were starting to gather, and they were asking uncomfortable questions.
The warden knew entering the prison was the only way to bring the mayhem to an end, and he still had an ace up his sleeve.
Here's where the subterranean tunnel system comes into play.
Down the end of this hallway, you can see a set of stairs that's going up. Those are the ones that goes up to the main entrance where there's a metal door in the floor. The negotiators and prison officials, when they came down, worked their way all the way to the end of this tunnel to where the chapel is.
The tunnel was perfect because you could secretly enter from the outside and end up right in the middle of the prison.
And right here is where they would have been, both the negotiators on this side, the rioting inmates on the other side, and they would have been talking to each other.
Meanwhile, National Guard forces were gathering at a gymnasium just 4 blocks away. The city switchboards were being overrun with calls, some of them from as far away as London, England.
Reporters descended on the town. The eyes of the world were on Deer Lodge, and no one knew how the riot was going to end.
Miles and his right-hand man, Smart, were holed up in the southwest tower of the 1912 cell block. Now, this tower would soon become known as the Death Tower.
At about 4:45 a.m. on the 18th of April, 36 hours after the riot had began, the National Guard sprang into action.
This tower here is where they had the National Guard with the bazooka.
Over on the west side, I heard boom.
For the first one hit, which was a little too high. So then they tried a second one, readjusting their aim, and it came down and hit the right side of the right window.
Firing bazookas, a weapon designed to take out tanks, at a prison seems like something straight out of an over-the-top action film.
As Miles and Smart were reeling from the explosion, a team of guardsmen stormed the tower.
Miles and Smart were found dead, the result of a murder-suicide. The guards taken hostage were rescued from their cells, physically unharmed but mentally scarred.
A lot of people stopped working at the prison after the '59 riot, but for some, it was a lifestyle that they had no intention of giving up.
The last few decades of the prison passed by relatively peacefully. In 1974, construction began on a new facility on the outskirts of town. And 5 years later, the last inmates at the old Montana State Prison were transferred. Today, the prison has reopened to tourists, with guides like Ray entertaining visitors with stories of the incredible events that took place here.
Deer Lodge has had a long and special relationship with the prison, and I imagine that the residents here are probably pleased that this new chapter is a much more peaceful one.
In the last frontier, there's a set of ruins which sparked one of America's greatest treasure hunts.
This is a place that not many people, even in Alaska, are aware exists. And yet, this was the beginning of a tremendous industry.
This is Douglas Island, and it's separated from Alaska's capital, Juneau, by a body of water known as the Gastineau Channel.
Rising out of the shallows is a structure like no other.
This is one of the weirdest abandoned buildings that I've ever seen. There's no obvious way in or out. There's a door, but the door's way up high.
Doesn't seem to be related to anything. What's it doing here?
One clue lies in the thick, temperate rainforest on the island's shore.
hidden under the layers of vegetation are all these concrete buildings.
These structures are now just shells of the buildings that were once here. They're clearly very old.
Among them, there's debris that suggests an industrial origin.
Once, this was a glittering dream that put Alaska on the world map.
People flocked here from all over, and they experienced things never seen before.
But greed turned this rich landscape into a nightmare.
They weren't sure what was happening, but a huge geyser of water shot up.
Jim Garrity is exploring a set of ruins he's known since he was a boy.
This was my playground. My grandparents lived just down the street, and I was over here most days.
Today, this is on the edge of Juneau's growing suburbs. But in 1880, when its story began, it was a wild frontier. But Alaska was about to change forever.
The United States was dealing with this gold rush fever. This is just 30 years after the heyday of the California gold rush. People still know that fortunes can be made. All you have to do is find the gold.
With the precious metal running dry in California, prospectors were hunting for their next payload. And two men made a discovery here that would put this place on the map.
They found gold in large quantities, they said, that looked like peas and beans in size.
Almost overnight, others came wanting their share of the fortune. Among them was John Treadwell.
John Treadwell was a Canadian miner who was working for a wealthy man in California.
When he heard about the gold in Alaska, he wanted a piece of the pie, and he headed north to seek his fortune.
Soon after arriving and buying his claim, John Treadwell found gold.
He dug down, discovered a mother lode. But there was a twist.
John's discovery began a chain of events that would bring catastrophe to this island.
They had no idea how wrong it was going to go.
In the late 19th century, John Treadwell struck gold on his claim on Douglas Island, Alaska. But that's not all.
He discovered a gold vein, but he discovered also that that vein stretched beneath adjacent properties that he did not own.
Normally, when prospectors struck gold, they would shout it from the rooftops. But John Treadwell was much more clever. He kept his mouth shut. He then consolidated as many claims as he could on the island.
By 1882, much of the gold vein was under John's control, and excavations began. This is the Treadwell Gold Mine Complex.
This open pit here is the glory hole of the Treadwell mine. This was the first part of the mining. After this, there was some much more extensive works underground.
The ground became like a rabbit's warren of tunnels. Some even went down as far as 2,500 feet. That's a half a mile.
At its peak, this place operated 24 hours a day and processed 35,000 tons of ore a week. It became the largest operating hard rock gold mine in the world.
But key to its success was a resource that would also bring about the mine's downfall.
This building was the pump for the salt water that would pump salt water from the shore here at high tide up into the mill to be used to process gold.
Water is used in the mining process after the ore is crushed down, and when you run the water through it, you can dissolve out gold.
While the pump house kept the mine running, no one could have predicted the engineering revolution that this place would bring to Alaska.
Hidden underneath the blue mussels on the beach is one of the narrow gauge rail cars, but this would have run back and forth on the tracks here at Treadwell.
The whole of the Treadwell mine complex was really advanced for the time. It even had Alaska's first railway.
Despite the railway helping to make the mine profitable, In 1889, John Treadwell did something unexpected.
John Treadwell got out while he was ahead. He sold his business to a group of industrialists, including the Rothschilds, and he left with what would be the equivalent in today's money of more than $40 million.
The new owners put the mine in the control of a man ahead of his time.
The running of the mine was taken over by Frederick Worthen Bradley. He's considered one of the finest mining engineers the world has ever seen. In the 19th century, he would have been the equivalent of Steve Jobs or Elon Musk today.
But Bradley didn't just bring a technological revolution to Alaska. It's something known well to local resident Paulette Simpson.
Bradley wanted to take good care of his people, and the Treadwell mine paid well. In 1914, it was paying better than the Ford Motor Company.
With wages of $100 a month, the Treadwell mining complex attracted workers from as far as Europe, places like Scandinavia and Italy.
Yet it wasn't just high wages enticing workers to come to this desolate corner of Alaska.
Bradley created this club wherein they could go, cultivated the idea of a communal spirit, and keeping his workers happy, the mine remained productive.
So the Treadwell Club was like the community YMCA. They showed movies, there were Turkish baths, a bowling alley, it had Alaska's first swimming pool.
For nearly 3 decades, this remote mine hit rich pay dirt, digging and refining almost 100 tons of gold. But everything was about to come crashing down.
By 1917, the mine had gotten so deep that they really weren't making any money by going down deeper.
In an effort to increase productivity, they had mined into some of the load-bearing structures that were below the surface.
This decision turned the mine into a ticking time bomb, and it gave an ominous warning of the impending destruction.
When the ladies were swimming in the swimming pool one day, all of a sudden the water drained out of the pool. The workmen came to see what was going on. They sounded the alarm and they got all the miners out.
Water draining out of the swimming pool is a bad sign, but I don't think anyone could have known where it was going to go next. Because at that point, a huge geyser shoots up out of the Gastineau Channel.
Water started pouring into the upper works, and soon became a torrent and poured huge waterfall the size of Niagara into the mines for hours until everything was flooded.
With the alarm having been raised in time, miraculously, no one died during this disaster. But for most of the Treadwell mine complex, the dream was over.
One section of the mine avoided being flooded and continued to operate for a few years. But with the vein running out, the final nugget of gold was removed here in 1922.
Despite over a century passing since the closure of the mine, its legacy is still found across the state.
The mining industry is still going strong in Alaska. It's currently worth about $4.5 billion a year.
But tailings from the mines here have transformed the landscape. And today, it's a historical trail, enjoyed by the people of Juneau.
When we're walking over this nice sandy beach, all of this is crushed to remove the gold. If it wasn't for the mines, there would be no beach here. We'd have a rocky shore.
In New Orleans, the origin story of a cherished part of American culture lies in an unexpected place.
It was along this strip, few orphan buildings, where America's greatest gift to the world really took shape.
We're really close to the French Quarter and the heart of downtown New Orleans, but this little area is just nothing but parking lots and concrete. Makes you wonder why any buildings have survived at all.
Two forgotten structures once attracted the city's most exciting performers.
The cast of characters who frequented this street make for a very impressive list.
These are empty, abandoned-seeming spaces now, but 100 years ago, these would have been full of people having the time of their lives.
For one world-famous musician, it was on this street where everything began.
They gave him the tool to carry out his dream, would be as important as the person who first put a paintbrush in the hands of Picasso.
In New Orleans, one street hides the birthplace of a new musical genre. John McCusker is a proud New Orleanian whose curiosity about the musical history of his city turned into a professional hunt for answers.
After decades of neglect during Hurricane Ida, this structure went down. This was owned by the Karnofsky family. And if you look, you can still see the tile from their old business, the Model Tailors.
It was here that a famous name spent some of his most formative years.
The Karnofsky family was a Lithuanian Jewish family that lived in this area. And they employed a young man that grew up here named Louis Armstrong. Louis was their errand boy.
A young Louis Armstrong would not go on to be the person that he was if he did not have the support of his employer, the Karnofsky family.
He would have dinner with them every day. And after eating kosher, they would sing Yiddish lullabies to get the children to sleep. Well, Louis doesn't understand a word of Yiddish. Yet he wrote that I credit that Jewish family with teaching me to sing from my heart.
This is the 400 block of South Rampart Street, a young Louis Armstrong's stomping ground, and once one of New Orleans' most important entertainment hubs.
You could find theaters, music halls, brothels, saloons, all kinds of entertainment that was largely enjoyed under the cover of darkness.
When Louis wasn't with the Karnofskys, there was a good chance he could be found on the corner of the block, listening to the sounds coming from a now abandoned music venue.
Through here was the Eagle Saloon, operated by Frank Dewson of the Eagle Band.
The Eagle Band was one of the most important and influential jazz lineups of all time.
The list of musicians who at one point in time played in the Eagle Band is super impressive. I mean, it includes people like Bunk Johnson, Sidney Bechet, Baby Dodds.
The Eagle Band grew out of an earlier group who played on the third floor of this building. Their leader was Buddy Bolden.
Buddy Bolden. He's often considered by music historians to be the inventor of jazz.
If you came down here around nighttime, you might hear a cornet blast from the third story of this building, and that would be Buddy Bolden. The responses of the crowd were very emotional. They'd say, "Oh, play it, Mr. Bolden. Play it for us, Buddy."
But this was also the site of a near tragedy that could have changed the course of music history.
For young Louis Armstrong, it was on the corner outside the Eagle Saloon that a dramatic event occurred that threatened not only his musical career, but also his life.
The date was New Year's Eve, 1912.
Historically, the revelry of New Year's Eve included noise, costumes, and the shooting of guns.
When a couple of kids across the street pulled a gun and fired it in the air to mark the new year. Louis had also snuck a gun out of his house, and his friends knew he had it, so when the kid across the street fired, they said, "Get him, Louis." So he pulled out his gun and fired it in the air.
Louis could have been killed by law enforcement officers, but he was spared.
He was arrested before being packed off to a punishment home for wayward children.
A 12-year-old Louis Armstrong arrived at the Colored Waifs home and would spend 18 pivotal months here.
Well, Louis got his first major exposure to music education while he was incarcerated, and he eventually became leader of the Colored Waifs Home Brass Band.
On his release, Louis had just one thing on his mind: owning his own cornet. And it was just a few steps away from where he was arrested that his dream came true.
The Eagle Saloon wasn't the only tenant in this building.
Well, it was bustling. There were so many businesses here. You had barrooms, loan shop, a pawn shop. This part of the Eagle Saloon was part of Jake Itzkovich's pawn shop. And it was here that 14-year-old Louis Armstrong first came to pick out a horn to have to play. What an incredible moment in music history, and to be standing in the same space where that happened.
2 doors down from the Eagle Saloon, a new theater would be the place where Louis first revealed his musical genius to the world.
This is foundational American history.
South Rampart Street played a crucial role in the birth of jazz and the shaping of a young Louis Armstrong.
Beginning in 1914, this was a solid bet to come and get entertained. This was the Iroquois Theater. They had silent movies and vaudeville performances. These would all be rows of seats, just like you would have in any theater.
People could go and catch a variety of different kinds of acts, everything from slapstick comedy to Shakespeare to trained animals and magic.
They had talent shows at the Iroquois, and local performers would get up there and try out. One of those people was little teenage Louis Armstrong, and he got on the stage and did a little song and dance routine, and he won the contest.
In his later performances, you can really observe the influence of the vaudeville showmanship that he would have picked up here.
The Iroquois Theater and Eagle Saloon left an indelible mark on Louis Armstrong and inspired him to embark on a musical career that would end up with him as one of America's greatest artists.
In 1918, Armstrong began working on the riverboats going up and down the Mississippi, and this is where his music career really began to take off.
Louis left New Orleans for Chicago in 1922 to join a band headed by Joe King Oliver, an established musician he first heard play at the Eagle Saloon. However, for South Rampart Street, its days as the city's top destination for entertainment were waning.
The 2,000-seat Lyric Theater was beginning to siphon audiences off to the French Quarter.
Live performances at the Iroquois Theater wound down sometime around 1920, and it wasn't long after that the Eagle Saloon followed.
By the 1950s, South Rampart Street's days as an entertainment hub were over.
A combination of luck and passionate preservationists saved these 2 buildings from destruction, but they're largely still unused and sit desolate, waiting for someone to do something with them.
In 2021, the Karnofsky Building was destroyed by Hurricane Ida.
This was a tragic loss for the city, but this wasn't the end of this historic building's story.
Drew Sparacia, through his historic real estate company, is determined to preserve as much as possible from the rubble.
Knowing that these bricks are part of history, we instructed our folks to clean them all so we can use them in the reconstruction of the historic Karnofsky shop.
For the Eagle Saloon, there are hopes it will soon be turned into a jazz museum and for the Iroquois to be reborn as a music venue. But for now, they remain silent reminders of a raucous and pioneering time in American music history.
They are our last monuments to the place that gave us jazz, the place that gave us Louis Armstrong.
In what was once known as the Empire State of the South lie the ruins of a place that thrust civilians into the middle of a bloody conflict.
We're in Georgia, just on the edge of metro Atlanta. And there's this beautiful, tranquil wilderness. It's like you've stepped back in time from the bustling city.
This must be what this land was like before humans came here. It feels incredibly unspoiled.
Among the pristine forest hides a dilapidated building.
This huge building looms over you. It's completely in ruins. It's like the skeleton of a brick structure.
When I first came down here, it was pretty amazing to see a structure like this. The architecture, aesthetic of it here out in the middle of the woods next to a beautiful creek, pretty astonishing.
It's perched right on the bank of the river, almost like it could get swept away at any moment.
This peaceful place hides a dark past, something that today would see commanders go to prison for war crimes.
On the bank of Sweetwater Creek in Georgia, the remains of a once imposing structure still bear the scars of its cruel fate. Park Ranger Michael Gardner is making sure its story is not forgotten.
There's a lot of history here. People harnessed water power to provide resources for the South. They made a lot of money here.
But the rise of this local industry was paid for in blood.
The great cash crop that made Georgia so economically powerful at the time was picked by enslaved people, and it was cotton.
In 1846, construction began on a cotton mill to process the fiber they called white gold.
Back then, there was no heavy machinery, so everything had to be animal-driven. Slaves made all the bricks by hand. The granite you see, the walls here, that was all brought in.
This is the New Manchester Mill.
Originally known as the Sweetwater Mill, after the creek it was built on, the building was 48 by 120 feet, 5 stories, and was said to be taller than any building in Atlanta.
The mill grew so successful that a company town was built around it.
It became known as New Manchester, home of the New Manchester Manufacturing Company. This was a tribute to the British city that was so central to the global cloth trade that it became known as Cottonopolis.
There was about 200 workers or so that worked in the mill. They were self-sufficient. A lot of them had farms. They had a general store.
But in 1861, the Civil War exploded into action, providing the mill with a new opportunity that would prove to be a double-edged sword.
At the beginning of the war, the Confederate Army placed an order with the New Manchester Mill for $25,000 worth of Army uniforms.
Although many prominent families associated with this mill had Union sympathies, their sons did not. And these sons enlisted with Confederate forces, and they wore uniforms made out of material from this very mill.
Little did they know, this decision would seal their fate.
Uniforms were one of the most important things for the Confederate Army after food and weapons. And so cotton mills became high-value targets for the Union Army as it advanced.
By 1864, the Confederacy was struggling, and Atlanta's fall looked all but certain. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman was on the offensive, putting the mill in grave peril.
Sherman reached Atlanta. They did have Confederate troops here. However, they withdrew those troops to protect the city of Atlanta. The only thing left here was the workers.
The workers had no choice but to await their fate.
Soldiers entered the factory, pulled the drive belts out of the machinery, and removed the cloth and threads from the looms and spindles. Initially, it seemed to be a relatively peaceful takeover.
But just as the mill workers thought they might be spared, chilling new orders came from the top.
The Union decided we'll just burn it down, deny the Confederacy any assets. Just up here, you have some remains from that burn. You can see some of the charred wood from where the flooring was.
Sherman had ordered the New Manchester mill workers to be kidnapped and deported to the north, along with many others from across the South.
Unknown to them, the workers had been declared enemy operatives.
The Union took them as POWs or refugees, depending on whose side you want to look at. They marched them all the way to Marietta, which is just north of here, and put them on boxcars, sent them to Kentucky.
These civilians were essentially charged with treason, but they were never tried in court.
Once in the north, their situation did not improve. There was no work, and many of the refugees died from disease, starvation, and exposure.
Just a handful would return to Georgia after the war and find their mill and small company town in ruins.
Decimated and abandoned, the mill surrendered to the forest around it.
Post-Civil War and during Reconstruction, the building was just more or less forgotten about. Throughout the years and decades later, locals used it for target practice or camping or recreation.
But in recent years, the ruins of the New Manchester Mill have served an unexpected industry.
We've had a lot of film and TV productions done here. Hunger Games, they filmed some scenes down here by the creek.
In Mockingjay Part 1, the mill is used as part of a bombed-out landscape, ironically during a rebellion of rural workers fighting against an elite in the capital.
Today, these ruins stand as a testament to this region's incredible history. But they will need a helping hand to survive in Georgia's humid climate.
Since 2016, Georgia state parks have taken steps to preserve the ruins and prolong the life of the structure.
Southerners' strength, apart from music and food, is probably their connection with history, all the good parts and all the bad parts. So to me, preserving this is an important piece of that so people can learn from it.